So, our topic is juvenile sex offenders, and we're going to be taking some time and discussing sort of some of the research that we found. The people involved in this group is Christy, myself, Callie, and Michelle. So, we'll start off on discussing the population.
So juvenile sex offenders are going to be individuals age 17 or younger because they are juveniles, they're minors, who have committed a crime that is of sexual nature. They have been processed through a juvenile court system rather than the adult court system or any kind of civil court system. And Michelle found a really good statistic on the juvenile correctional facilities in Kansas, and 37% of boys within that system are sex offenders in the year 2016.
And we're going to spend some time talking about the statistics.
Mm-hmm. So in 2018, forgive me because I forgot what they were called, but the police departments all came together and brought in a statistics of what kind of arrests were made with juvenile offenders in their area. As you can see, we've got them classified out by urban. There are 6 counties in the state of Kansas that are urban, and that is the Kansas City area, and also Topeka, Leavenworth, Lawrence area, and then also down into Wichita. And that is where the highest number of arrests, other than the semi-urban, which includes Wichita. So that kind of gives you an idea where we're at. The more rural areas, the least amount of population is there's 17 arrests in the rural area, and then of course 2 in the frontier. To kind of give you an example, Ford, Finney, and Seward counties are considered considered densely rural areas. Grant, Haskell, Stevens, and Gray counties, and also Scott counties are considered rural, and then the other counties in southwest Kansas are considered frontier, and that's by the population of people per square mile.
Okay.
And in those arrests, this kind of gives you an idea of what the actual charges were or the actual arrests were made for, either sex crimes, pornography, forced fondling, sodomy, kidnapping, abduction, or rape. In 2014, the average stay for a felony charge was 26 months. A misdemeanor charge was 25 months. It was kind of interesting that a misdemeanor and a felony charge are only a month difference on their average length of stay. And in 2016, there are 787 youths in Kansas that are currently on probation. 734 are in custody, and there are 219 youths in correctional facilities in the state of Kansas. This is just kind of a list of the sex crimes requiring registration, and I kind of thought it was interesting. It does apply for minors as well as it does apply for adults. So it kind of gives you an idea of which different crimes they consider that would give them a lifetime worth of registration versus 25 years and 15 years.
So when I was doing some research, I found a couple things that quite a few authors pointed out as far as problematic policy. So that would be the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. Specific statute is the Adam Walsh Protection and Safety Act of 2006. Megan's Law was another one they mentioned, but that was less restrictive compared to this one. This one, according to Leah 2015, states that adolescents age 14 and older at the time of the crime are subject to registration for up to 25 years to life. And crimes must be comparable to or more severe than aggravated sexual assault against a person younger than 12. and individual states are no longer given discretion over whether or not these people have to register. So under this Adam Walsh Protection and Safety Act, we're seeing more minors on this registry, where we typically just see adults.
I also did some research during my literature review and did find some stuff that related to policy and legislation. One of the things that I found really interesting is that a lot of the cases are being waived into adult criminal court cases, and that increased by 71%, specifically in the time frame of 1995 to 1994. So this is just an example of legislative problems, because as we talk about those statistics, some of the juvenile cases maybe are being counted into adult statistics rather than it being counted into the juvenile cases. And also a lot of changes that were made in the statutes affected like 90%, 90% of the states, and Kansas was one of them. So that was kind of just relating back to some of the things that Callie mentioned.
And going off what Maria was saying, as far as they're pushing these kids into adult court, it's really problematic because when you think about it, at the end of the day, juvenile sex offenders are under the age of 18. So they're kids, but usually when we see like adult sex offenders on a registry, no one feels bad. They're getting their faces plastered all over the neighborhood. And it's you don't want them around your kids, you don't want them around your schools, but it's a completely different playing field when it's minors, because at the end of the day, these are children, and they're kind of getting thrown into this very adult-like punitive decision. So.
Well, I agree, because like the states give permission for the public to access juvenile records because they're on the registry. So, I mean, I think that's something that's really controversial, in respecting their privacy.
And these kids haven't even reached maturity.
Yeah.
I mean, their brains aren't fully developed even in some of these instances. Kansas has a 13-year-old that's incarcerated as of 2016. And it's like, and who knows if they come out of that lifetime registration, they're 13. It's like, do they really know what they did? Do they understand?
They can technically be charged at the age of 10. And one specific county that I worked for did charge at the age of 10 for something like fondling, and they took it to trial.
And did they have to register until their life, their entire life?
I don't know what ended up happening. I just know that was put onto the record, and they got some probation, not actual jail time, but I'm not sure about the registration. I just know that they were charged. So that's on a 10-year-old's record.
I mean, obviously the things that Michelle had listed out as lifetime registered offenses are pretty extreme. And again, we're looking, like we said, at children. And that really segues into the slide about the common misconceptions about juvenile sex offenders. So beginning in the 1980s, there was this model where we're kind of approaching juvenile sex offenders as though they are these 5 Ds. So deviant in terms of sexual behavior, delinquent, disordered, deficient-ridden, and deceitful. And research has shown that the 5 Ds are an inaccurate depiction of juvenile sex offenders, and that we have to take into consideration these unique developmental factors, like we were saying, where their brain, especially that prefrontal cortex, isn't fully developed. And then looking at the juvenile sex offenders, they're more likely to reoffend non-sexually than other offenders. So it's not that they have these deviant interests. Research was showing that they're more interested in age-appropriate sexual relations with peers. They might have just fondled or tried to engage in those behaviors with someone younger at the time. There's nothing that says that they're into pedophilia or anything like that because they themselves are children.
In your guys' research, were you able to find how many of these kids, maybe with the more severe crimes, were sexually abused themselves?
I didn't find anything.
Didn't find anything?
Mm-mm.
It would be interesting.
I did.
Especially when we look at cycles of abuse.
Correct, yeah.
I did kind of get something. They didn't give me statistics specifically, but they did state that their recidivism rate is higher in kids who were sexually offended or sexually abused themselves rather than those who were not. So those who weren't sexually abused had lower rates of recidivism, like it was just a one-time thing,
Mhm.
whereas those who were continued to engage in these acts. But I don't have the specific percentages. I just know it was higher for one than the other.
Mm-hmm.
So within the juvenile sex offender community, with these registration policies and these different court systems and what they're having to do and people finding out what they've done in the past, different offenses, we see these significant barriers arise. So those are going to be things like stigmatization and social isolation within the community, because once everybody finds out you're a sex offender, they probably don't want to be around you. And that's also going to carry over into your family, because typically, especially in small areas, you know who the family is, and it's never just one person gets the blame. It's usually the familial unit. It's that family's bad. Um, and it will have negative repercussions for siblings as well as parents, kind of thing. And then possible recidivism, but like I said, general recidivism is more common than sexual recidivism, but it is still a concern. So are they doing this fondling now, but maybe breaking and entering is going to be a problem in the future? It's just, we've got to find a way to really address them where they're at and teach them skills they need to be productive members of society, since they are so young and their brains are still developing. And then in terms of mental health, when we put all these things together, we're going to see anxiety, depression, and then some impaired social and emotional functioning.
I did some research for the presenting problem. Um, One of the things that I really got into in terms of my research was that, well, more or less what I'm talking about in this is that this is the research that's been done. Um, so one of them is the generalist versus specialist perspective, and this is based off of the severity of the offense. Basically, people have been researching whether, like, the generalist perspective is general therapy that are used for kids who just offend, working for these kids who are sexual offenders. So, like, will the therapy that we use for conduct disorder work for kids who are offending sexually? And then the specialist perspective is, do we need actual like a special type of therapy to address the offense, and is that how maybe they get the help that they need? And based off of the research, that this type of therapy really depends on the severity of the offense. If we're saying rape and they're maybe targeting children specifically time and time again, then they're going to need specialists. Whereas maybe it was fondling and they just don't know personal boundaries, and it's going to be more like of a generalist approach. And then they also had research if there was a difference between sex offender juveniles versus non-sexual offending juveniles. So those who steal versus those who sexually abuse. Is it just deviance behavior? And they did find that there was a difference, of that kids who tend to abuse sexually maybe have more problems with personal boundaries, trust issues, and stuff like that, versus kids who just maybe steal. And then there are differences between juveniles who target like children versus peer. So those who target children, specifically like that age range, so we're talking about maybe like more of like the adults who target children. There's such a thing like that in juveniles as well. And then there's kids who are more like opportunistic, like it just happened that someone just happened to be there, and it could be adult or a child. So those who offend against their peers are treated, have, I guess, a higher success rate in treatment than those who specifically target children. And then they've done a lot of research regarding the effectiveness of programs and interventions. This is also mine. It talks about effective intervention approaches, what they've seen to be working, because this is the literature review was talking about which ones seem to be more effective than the other. Obviously, brief cognitive behavioral therapy was really successful compared to kids who engaged in group play therapy. And this was done through a 10-year longitudinal study, so it wasn't effective for only like 2 months. I mean, this had a 10-year impact. So cognitive behavioral therapy seemed to be really successful. But also in the research, I found that recidivism rates were lower in kids who actually succeeded and completed the program versus those who didn't. And I found that community centers tend to kick kids out before they even were completed with the program. So I'm not sure why community centers are kicking this kids out, but I think it goes back to what Callie was talking about, stigmatism, like we're not going to work with these kids. And also early intervention have immediate and delayed effects. Some kids immediately respond to therapy, whereas kids, you might not see the effect of it till later on in their lives. And also kids who receive multisystemic therapy, the recidivism rates, as you can see, is much lower. It's 12.5% versus 25% for non-sexual offenders. And those in specialized programs tend to have 7 to 13% of recidivism rates. So that shows how maybe specialist programs could help kids who maybe have more severe offenses. And one of the biggest things that I found, and I think is the most impactful, is that the highest success rate are those who coordinate the criminal justice system with therapeutic system. So perhaps the probation officer would collaborate. They would be acting case manager to make sure that these kids are following through, because the therapist can't do it all, and they have to keep in contact because they are kind of like a motivator, like, you kids have to do this and I'm going to make sure you do this, because that's not the therapist's job. That's sort of like going into criminal justice. They have to be the ones making sure that they complete what they need to do.
And that kind of goes in.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It just kind of goes in with like the whole idea of like integrated care too, because even though that's not like within one facility, it's really integrating all these community systems that are going to interact with this one juvenile and kind of doing what they need to do to make them successful.
Yeah, and that's why the multisystemic therapy recidivism rates were a lot lower compared to just like cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then in regards to barriers for treatment for the juvenile offenders, this is just some basic information about what each of the like the definitions of what you guys have already discussed as far as registration, community notification, and residency restriction laws, which refers to mostly state and local ordinances that limit the registrant's ability to live in a certain location, like near a school, I saw some research where they are not allowed to live near swimming pools in communities. So I thought that was interesting.
Now, are those, you said state and local laws or state and local ordinances, the ones that you looked at, like the swimming pool one, was that in Kansas, or is that kind of like a nationwide statistic?
What I found was in Kansas. You know, I assume that it's probably nationwide also.
Mm-hmm. I heard similar things with parks.
Yes.
You're not allowed to live too close to a park. Anywhere children are the majority of the population.
Which is very hard, I would assume, for children who are offenders to not be able to go, you know, I'm not sure if they're allowed to go play unsupervised at parks.
No.
So, and then the mental health services in Western Kansas are, you know, as we know, very limited. In my research, I could only find like one sex offender program that's for juveniles in Liberal, one in Larned, 2 in Dodge City, 0 in Garden City. 93 therapists who specialize in sex offender services in Eastern Kansas, and which is the Kansas City metro area, and excuse me, 35 in the Wichita area. I know there are mental health providers that, you know, children can see, like community mental health centers, but as far as having like a sex offender program, I couldn't find any in Garden City.
One of the programs in the Wichita Hutchinson area is through Prairie View. So I had a professor in undergrad who worked for that program, and she kind of did the case management aspect where she would check in on them and come up with not necessarily like a treatment plan, but a plan for probation. So, they're going to engage in these services, these programs in order to meet it. And she kind of had to sit down with them and find like extracurricular activities for them to do. And she said her main struggle was that they were trying to do activities that were made for younger children. So kind of trying to like wean them onto peer relationships versus maybe interests that aren't so age appropriate.
Right. Yes. And I believe, like the programs that are offered in Dodge and Liberal are, I can't remember the name of the workbook, but I think the child completes this workbook and then they're finished with the program. I don't think it's as in detail as what you just described, Callie. Okay. And then some of the other barriers are, as you guys mentioned earlier, having that, the takes a village type of, model is very inconsistent between the courts and social workers and probation officers. There can be a delay in the coordination of appropriate therapeutic services. I'm assuming, especially out in like Western Kansas, where, those services are limited. Financial barriers due to court costs, cookie cutter approaches, despite the severity of the crime. So that kind of goes back to that workbook, regardless if it was forcible rape or, the fondling, they all have the same treatment. And then court-ordered services are not covered by insurance. That goes along with, I personally had a sex offender child on my caseload, and he was court-ordered to do drug testing, the mental health evaluations, and a drug and alcohol evaluation if he had any positive drug tests. And that became on top of all the court costs and, the therapeutic services. So. Okay. And then, Michelle.
Yes, ma'am.
You're the one who told me about this program that they tried to do in Dighton, and the city, the community members are came together and objected this idea. And although it was for adult offenders, if this had been brought out, if this had been given a chance, I think that, maybe there would have been an opportunity for some more juvenile offender treatment out in, the very rural areas of Western Kansas.
Well, and I think this goes back to the stigmatism that the smaller communities, I mean, Dighton's pretty isolated up there. There's not a whole lot there. There's, a road, one that goes east and west, one that goes north and south, and pretty much that's about it at Dighton. I mean, there's not a whole lot else up there. But you bring that in, and these small towns, and I mean, I'm from one of them, they don't want this because they're scared for their own kids. They want that safe place for them. And I think that goes back to where there's not any programs out here because people are like, let Wichita handle it. Let the big city handle it. They just don't want that stigmatism out here.
Right. And there was, there could have been a lot of job opportunities, but then they came back and said, well, we don't have enough people in our community that have that level of education or expertise to help them. So were you going to say something, Callie? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well, just whenever you consider like the idea of community reintegration after treatment, with those like registration laws and the community notification that you were talking about, it just makes it really hard in small communities to think about them moving forward and doing something productive, because obviously if your whole community knows what you did, and with this whole objection to predator project article that you found, I mean, they obviously don't want you in the community, so it makes you wonder what life would be, if they would even have a productive life in these communities when everybody knows what they did.
Exactly.
And when you were talking about financial barriers too, when they do hit that stigmatism and the family ends up having to just totally relocate.
Yes.
And that's even more of a burden on the family because now they're trying to sell a home or, rent. They're trying to move. They've already got all these expenses, but yet they're needing to pay for all these expenses for their kids, or,
Right.
whatever happened with their child or children. And so it's a hardship.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and then just a little bit of information about some residential facilities. There are not, that I know of, any in Western Kansas. I believe the closest is Wichita that takes juveniles. So just a little bit of statistical data that although there was a 50% decrease in juvenile arrests, there was only a 24% reduction in the number of youth held in residential facilities. So basically they're just keeping them longer than they need to be kept. And I'm not sure if that's due to not sure, where they're going to reintegrate to, if they're going to be safe in the community, maybe just lack of therapists that can determine if they're safe to be in the community again. And then the research shows that residential commitments generally fail to reduce reoffending. So, and then with residential facilities also, a scarcity of evidence and community-based interventions combined with a lack of statewide standardized practices had led to a geographically inconsistent outcome. And an out-of-home population largely composed of lower-level juvenile sex offenders. So a lot of children are put into foster care. Okay, and then as far as barriers to access to healthcare services, I did find some research regarding medications that are used to reduce testosterone, but I wasn't able to find if that was used on juveniles and how expensive that might be. And I do believe that in adults, insurance and Medicaid was covering that, but I'm not sure for juvenile. And I think, Michelle, you had mentioned that you thought that juveniles, if they were like a registered sex offender, they didn't qualify for a medical card. Is that something that you had found?
There is some restrictions, and I think it's a case by case
Oh.
of what the charges were if they were convicted of a felon or what the actual issue was.
Oh, okay. And then the youth in juvenile correctional system are at a high risk population. Many have unmet physical, developmental, and mental health needs. Multiple studies have found that some of the health issues occur at a high rate with this population, more so than the general adolescent population. And that could be to, parental neglect, maybe things like that. And then the financial barriers due to the court costs that I mentioned earlier, and as well as all the other court-ordered services that are not covered by insurance.
Okay, so these are just some recommendations for community-based programs that I found, just because the research showed that a lot of community-based programs are kicking kids out before they even finish the program. So these are just some recommendations that have shown to cause a positive impact. The first is establishing positive self-esteem and pride in one's cultural heritage. It's a lot of teaching and enhancing social skills, respecting others, respecting the self, and respecting other people's spaces. Also teaching impulse and coping skills like impulse control, and then teaching assertiveness skills and conflict resolution so that they can manage anger. Also enhancing programs so that we can work on empathy, promote greater appreciation for negative impact, and like how that can impact the victim's family. And also teach about relapse prevention. What are triggers, the cycles, the feelings and thoughts related to perhaps acting out sexually? What are the environmental circumstances? And also being able to identify those triggers and then being able to cope would be really successful in managing that behavior.
And I would say some of that stuff could easily be covered too in those like independent living programs. because I know that one sex offender that was a juvenile that I worked with in the past, he was autistic. So that obviously caused some more challenges as far as like social cues and personal boundaries and why it's not okay to touch someone that way. So definitely everything that you have in that list is something that could be incorporated in those programs as well for some populations that are considered higher needs.
And I think, in incorporating the schools with this information, if it's coming from every aspect of their life, they might be able to get a better understanding of the importance, especially of, other people's space and boundaries and things like that.
It's similar to the dating violence programs they've started implementing. The sooner you implement it and make people aware that it's an issue, it seems like it has better long-term results.
Yes.
Now, Callie, I'm sorry, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, go ahead.
I would say, Callie, since you came from Wichita and you've kind of been exposed to more programs, do you see that Western Kansas is really lacking in these services? I mean, we've got the statistics, but I mean the actual where when somebody needs something, you can go down the street in Wichita, but if we need something out here, they go down the highway to Wichita. Do you see a lot of that being an issue?
Yeah, and even like the client that I mentioned before, he ended up in a PRTF because of his behaviors, and they were pretty sexually inappropriate, but they thought the PRTF would be a good fit because you're so like strictly supervised, and that one was in Salina. KVC Wichita opened after I left, but obviously that opens a lot more doors. So even when his family was upset, hey, the closest he can be placed is Salina, that's an hour and a half drive from Wichita versus if there's someone out on the frontier or these densely rural areas, you're going to do a day's driving back and forth to even have them exposed to these programs. And there's more than one CMHC in Wichita or the Wichita surrounding area. They have a lot of community-based programs as far as attendant care and psychosocial rehab in group and individual settings. And so if you can't get it from one provider, you can go down the street and get it from another one, like you said. So it does come up as frustrating when you think about, Wichita has all these things, and it's not to say that their programs are perfect. I mean, there's still stuff that's lacking in those programs. To even have these facilities available seems to be the big difference between Eastern and Western Kansas.
And with the PRTF and Hayes, with them closing would they just close the juvenile section?
Yeah.
It's just adults now.
Yeah, you have to go to Wichita now. It's the closest facility.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I don't even know how big it is.
I was going to say, sorry, I have one more recommendation that I didn't add on here, and I think is super important because I don't think all of us, as maybe future therapists need to know, but one of the big tightening of assessments that they recommended through the research is to not conduct any evaluation till post-adjudication. So not to do assessments prior to court sentencing because that can be used against a juvenile in the court. So it's often temporary for them to be placed out of home or somewhere else so that whatever they say in therapy isn't used against them. So once they're adjudicated and given their charges, then I think therapy and perhaps interventions can start. But before that, no, because then we might be doing more harm than good. I mean, it just kind of depends on what the nature of the crime was.
Were you guys, oh, sorry, Christy.
That's okay.
Were you guys also finding stuff about a lack of evidence-based assessment tools kind of screen for recidivism? Because I saw that a couple different times, and I don't know if it's just that, these recommendations are saying to make programs more effective. It's just, a matter of time that once these programs are implemented, they'll find a better assessment tool. But there was like maybe two that they said had the best reliability and validity, and that was it.
Oh, wow.
But when you're talking like in Kansas, it's such a small population. So like last year in 2018, there was 121 arrests in Kansas that had sexual offenses for juveniles. And that is such a small number. So it's hard for like Kansas to do much research on that. So we rely on those big cities to do all the research. Well, they've got enough of that they don't have time for research. You know, so it's kind of hard to have that evidence-based to be able to do something about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen how different urban and rural areas are too. So it's like you can do this stuff with the urban, but then we still need the rural. And like you said, there's not a large, I don't think there's a large pull anywhere from the community to research juvenile sex offenders. I think kind of one of those populations we like to pretend they don't exist until we need our pitchforks and our torches.
But I think we have to keep in mind that it's not happening. When at my time at the Child Advocacy Center, 9 out of 10, the prosecute actually 9.8 out of 10, the prosecutor just did not want to charge, and it's simple as that. I had one who would charge anybody, and the rest will not, because one, they know that the community does not believe that people get sexually abused, or they don't think they can win the case, so why charge? So these kids that maybe need the help aren't getting charged. So there's no recommendation for therapy. There's no court order. Not saying that maybe court orders is what we need, but maybe just something more effective that even if we get a DCF report, maybe we should start including intervention and prevention and all that stuff.
And it's interesting that you brought that up because, you know, I go to court a lot, and I go to court in these very small communities such as Dighton. And I see a lot of, you know, maybe like the good old boy club where, you know, everybody does know everybody. And sometimes, you know, children of prominent community members, you know, do crimes and that are sexually related, and there are no charges pressed. And so therefore, like you said, no treatment. You know, those children don't receive any kind of treatment, even if it's just individual therapy. So
How do you guys get referrals for juvenile sex offenders, Christy, when you come into contact with them? Is it just if they're in state custody, or is it court refers them to Family Pres, anything like that?
Yeah, the court can refer to Family Pres, DCF can, the county attorney can. So like the case that I had, that it was successfully closed, but they also moved, you know, so I don't know how, you know, if he's going to reoffend. He has offended twice, and the court, you know, ordered me to, instead of him going through, you know, corrections, he went through me. And so I had to make sure that he did his community service and that they paid their fines and he completed his sex offender treatment. You know, so unfortunately, I will not know how effective that was. Yeah.
Well, I think we made a lot of good points, and I hope this video was very helpful for someone.
Yeah.
Here
Anyway.
Thank you guys for all of your really hard work on this. This was interesting to learn more about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you.
Oh.